Thank you very much. It's nice to be back here in Berlin again. 2015 was the centenary of the events in the Ottoman Empire in which up to 1.5 million Armenians met their death. Historians on all sides are more or less in agreement on what took place, but present-day Turkey and Armenia continue to be in open disagreement on whether to call these events a genocide or not. And even if this is highly unlikely to lead to any kind of armed conflict between Turkey and Armenia, it continues to prevent a normalization of their relations. This is merely one example of how history continues to play a role in creating and stoking conflicts and to hamper efforts at conflict resolution. Even when conflicts are resolved with peace agreements, the unaddressed history you think you have buried can return as zombies to haunt you and at worst lead to a renewal of the conflict. In my work, both as a historian and foreign minister, I have countless times come across how history, even very ancient history, keeps surfacing as an ingredient used in conflicts. Most historians will deplore those in our profession who have willingly lent their names and work for questionable purposes. But even without the involvement of historians themselves, their work can be abused and misused for nefarious purposes. So, together with some colleagues, we asked how could we, as historians, bring our knowledge, research, and experience to help in preventing and resolving conflicts, and in particular, to act against the abuse of history. With this in mind, we founded the Historians Without Borders in Finland as an NGO in June 2015. Our organization today has more than 300 members, including most of the history professors in our universities, as well as diplomats, researchers, and others working with international relations and conflict resolution. Our founding meeting was addressed by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, President Martti Ahtisaari, who recalled the many occasions where historical issues complicated his efforts as peace mediator. Our purpose was to make this initiative truly global, and we therefore arranged the International Conference on the Use and Abuse of History in Conflicts at the University of Helsinki in May last year. And the conference ended with the 300 participants agreeing on a declaration creating the network of Historians Without Borders. And in this declaration, the signatories pledged to continue working together in order to deepen general and comprehensive knowledge and understanding of history, promote open and free access to historical material and archives, encourage interactive dialogue between different views and interpretations of history to assist the process of mutual understanding. Support efforts to identify the abuse of history in fostering and sustaining conflicts, to help diffuse conflicts and contribute to conflict resolution processes, to promote the teaching of history in the spirit of this declaration, and to incorporate an understanding of the role of women and gender perspectives in efforts to build peace and resolve conflicts. And accordingly, we invited all historians and others working with historical issues and international relations who wish to build a better mutual understanding of history and want to prevent the misuse of history to create and foster conflicts to join our network. A significant part, and maybe even a majority of all conflicts, which are easily perceived as nationalist, ethnic, or religious conflicts, also have some economic and social causes. Discrimination on these grounds will also foster economic and social inequalities. Some are manifestly about social divisions, such as the bloody civil war in Finland, which broke out shortly after our declaration of independence in January 1918. But social divisions and unequal access to economic resources are also at work in most ethnic, religious, and other conflicts where groups with different identities are pitted against each other. When addressing the issue of economic development, conflict, and history, it is obvious that we cannot ignore studying the effects of colonialism. At its heyday, the colonial carve-up of the world was almost global. 42 independent states became founding members of the League of Nations in 1920. At the end of the Second World War, most of the lands in the maps of the world were still painted in the pink of the British Empire, the purple of the French realm, and other colors of the colonial powers. When the United Nations was founded, it had 51 member states, and today it has 193. And today we can speak of colonialism as history and take a critical look at its legacy. The consensus is without any doubt that regardless of some noble intentions and motives, colonialism was not guided by any Enlightenment principles. It left a legacy which varied on balance from, at best, benign neglect to the absolutely dreadful, the latter mostly found in those countries in which the colonial masters tried to hold on with force when faced with national liberation movements demanding and fighting for independence. The lasting legacy of colonialism can be seen on every world map, where many of the borders were originally drawn actually here in Berlin at the conference in 1878 and in other colonial events. It is also true that efforts by the colonial powers to retain their influence after their colonies had achieved independence certainly continued in the guise of neocolonialism. The reality of neocolonialism should not be denied, as initially decolonialization was in most cases followed by forms of indirect economic, financial, and cultural hegemony, which has, however, slowly but surely been eroding. Not every colony was misruled and devastated, like the so-called Congo Free State during King Leopold's time. So the colonial legacy is undeniably varied, and blanket generalizations do not help us to understand the failures and successes of development. Colonial history, or the history of colonialism, has almost exclusively been written by historians either from the former colonial powers or the former colonies. Understanding the present and successful planning for the future calls not only for knowing the past, but also recognizing the different narratives of the past in order to build a common understanding and to prevent the misuse of history for sustaining and creating conflicts. This is something we hope our Historians Without Borders network can contribute to. It is right to conclude that colonialism and neocolonialism have no defense. It is also necessary to recognize that the legacy of the colonial era is still relevant. For example, in the discourse on who bears the heaviest responsibility for centuries of unfettered greenhouse gas emissions and the consequent burden sharing to limit climate change today. And this is surely one of the most important arguments complicating climate change negotiations. At the same time, there should also be an expiry date after which colonialism and neocolonialism should no longer be accepted as excuses for most failures in the developing countries, 50 years after the main bulk of colonies became independent. This conclusion is supported by the observation that it is usually the most corrupt and dictatorial leaders in Africa and elsewhere who have been the loudest in their condemnation of colonialism as the cause of all their countries' failures, while they themselves have been very adept at embracing all the colonial examples of rapacious expropriation, stifling dissent, and trampling human rights. During the 60s, it became fashionable to talk about the Third World, originally used to define countries that remained non-aligned with either capitalism and NATO, which, along with its allies, represented the First World, or communism and the Soviet Union, which, along with its allies, represented the Second World. Due to many of the Third World countries being extremely poor, it became a stereotype such that people commonly referred to underdeveloped countries in general as Third World countries. The Third World was rarely precisely defined. In everyday use, it has been used interchangeably with the global South and developing countries to describe the poorer countries that have struggled to attain steady economic development. In the so-called dependency theory, as represented by writers such as Raoul Prebisch, Paul Baran, and André Grunde Frank, this obviously identifies me as a very 60s person, as still having these books in my library. The Third World has also been connected to the World Economic Division as the periphery countries in the world system that is dominated by the core countries. Due to the complex history of evolving meanings and context, there is no clear or agreed definition of the Third World. Of the institutionalized versions of Third World organizations, the G77, or G77 and China, as it is fittingly now called, is the most important and prominent. Founded in 1964 at the UNCTAD conference by 77 developing countries. Some countries, like Mexico and South Korea, have left the G77 to join the other side and are now members of the Industrialized Countries Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, already some 20 years ago. Looking back, we can regard 1974 as the zenith of Third Worldism. That was when the UN General Assembly, in the aftermath of the first oil crisis and driven by the G77, passed the Declaration for the Establishment of a New International Economic Order. This was a blueprint for a planned world economy which was never implemented and soon forgotten, and to be replaced by the neoliberal Washington consensus as the dominant paradigm for the global economy. The G77 has always been a heterogeneous group, united mainly in its determination to confront the First World rich, angling for aid and trade concessions from the developed countries is the, in some ways, raison d'être of the G77. But even this glue has been diluted as more and more countries in the group have growing diverging interest which cut across any simple north-south division lines. Thus, the G77 today finds it increasingly difficult to unite on common positions or to stick to them where once adopted. The complexity of different subgroups within the G77 is particularly clearly to be seen on climate change issues, where many groupings, such as the least developed countries, LDCs, OASIS, the small islands group, most directly vulnerable as climate change proceeds, and the basic group, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, which all have slightly different priorities and agendas. In the 60s and 70s, it was easy to think of the world as being divided into the rich North and poor South. The continued existence of abject poverty and its geographical concentration in the South is still true, but does not justify the continued adherence to a simplified North-South division. First, we should recognize the fact that within a few decades, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of abject poverty from living in the shadow of recurring famines, particularly in China and India and elsewhere in Asia. Progress is to be seen also in Africa and obviously in Brazil, which can point to the best results in poverty reduction the world has seen during the last decade. Within the G77, there is a clear stratification. The least developed countries, LDCs, were recognized as a specific group in 1971, comprising 48 countries today. Some of the original LDCs have graduated from the group. Most G77 countries today are classified as middle-income countries, or MICs. And this group too covers a wide income range, with the highest income MICs having a per capita income 10 times that of the lowest. And moreover, not all of the poorest people live in the LDCs. The MICs are home to 1/3 of the people across the globe living on less than $2 a day. Pockets of the kind of poverty usually associated with the former Third World can also be found in the countries of the wealthiest group. Income distribution within regions and countries which has developed in a more unequal direction, and particularly this is the case in those countries most beholden to neoliberal policies. This is an increasingly important indicator for assessing the success or failure of development efforts. So, what is the relationship between economic development and conflict? It is common and easy to assume that economic development will alleviate many causes for conflict. Economic crisis and slumps can indeed cause tensions which erupt in violent conflict. But paradoxically, so can also economic development too. And this is the case when its benefits are unequally distributed in a way which those left behind find intolerable. And this is actually what we are witnessing in today's world, albeit not primarily in the former Third World, but in the first one, with rampant nationalism, fundamentalism, and populism of many varieties. Actually, the only thing they have in common is that their simplistic solutions are unworkable in our world, which is increasingly characterized by growing interdependence. So closing frontiers and borders, erecting walls, is not a solution to any of the challenges that we are facing. We tend to overlook that there are three pillars for sustainable development: the ecological, economic, and social. Obviously, the lack of ecological sustainability is the most urgent given the ongoing climate change and diminishing biodiversity which we are every day witnessing. But social unsustainability cannot be ignored either. If 1% of the world's population owns half of its total wealth. And if just 8 of the richest people in the world, according to Oxfam figures, own as much wealth as the poorer half of the world's population, 3.7 billion people, then we are surely heading for troubled times. China, with a population of 1.3 billion and a nominal GDP of 10.9 trillion US dollars, is soon set to overtake that of the United States. And it will play an increasingly vital role for the future of the world, either for good or bad. Chinese companies are increasingly global actors, hungrily searching for investment opportunities worldwide, mostly, but not only in natural resources. And now, with the election of Donald Trump as the America First President of the United States, on a program promising border controls, walls, protectionism, and threatening trade wars with almost anyone, China's President Xi was able to present his country as the champion of free trade and responsible globalization, reversing the traditional roles of these two countries. Now, whether we will see a return to global trade wars is still, I hope, unlikely. Looking back at history, trade wars have a high correlation with real wars and have never, ever actually enriched anyone, but they have always caused great economic losses and suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm sure that you have inspired and provoked comments and questions. As always, if you could briefly raise your hand and introduce yourself so that Erkki knows where you're from, that would be excellent. So who would like to go first? The first question or comments? They don't dare. Just such an excellent. Your Excellency, would you like to? Okay. Okay, we'll start here. Okay, please.
Jürgen Trittin was here yesterday, and he was talking about trade wars leading to real wars. Is that an anxiety that you would share, that such trade wars lead to very real wars with weapons?
Well, there is a lot of talk about trade wars today, but nobody has really started one yet. And it remains to be seen, but hopefully reason will prevail. I'm sure that we will not be seeing any real advancement on multilateral trade negotiations. And bilateral trade negotiations are always the second best alternative or third best alternative if we cannot make progress on the multilateral front. So I think we have all to be very concerned about the future of world trade. Doesn't mean that everything is fine with the way that trade is managed today. But to change any rules, you cannot do it unilaterally. You have to do it within the WTO, for example, on how to develop a more balanced investment management regime.
Additional questions here?
Louise Monyamangini, I'm from South Africa. The Historians Without Borders, your research after it undoubtedly finds that colonialism has been undoubtedly an atrocity. Are there any talks of, or do you think there'll be talks of redressing that from colonizers, or is that just a pipe dream?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
You were talking about
yes.
Historians Without Borders, your research, and that colonialism is an atrocity.
Well, our organization is very much a shoestring operation at present. So we have a small office in Helsinki with 2 people, but we do have contacts I would say globally already. And we are working with bringing together historians, for example, between Ukrainian and Russian historians. We have had one seminar, we will have another at the end of August. We are exploring the similar activities in the Western Balkans and also between Israeli and Palestinian historians. And we will be next January arranging a larger seminar on colonial history in South Africa.
Excellent. Final question or comments? Yes, okay, please.
Hello, I'm Siru Tönru from Finland. So I would like to ask you, like, what do you think is the development cooperation the next thing to do? Like, should we do it more in Finland?
Well, fortunately, Finland is in a very delicate situation because our government, to which I am in opposition and the whole opposition was against this, has cut development assistance by 42% in a single year. And I don't think we have any other examples of such cuts in the world. This is very, very regrettable because ODA, Official Development Assistance, it remains a necessary and important ingredient in any development effort. However, we also know that investment funds, direct investment, and also remittances from migrants are much more important in terms of money, but still ODA remains very important, and it's very unfortunate that Finland has set a very bad example.
Any other comments or questions? Oh, yes, okay, please.
Hi, my name is Mina. I'm from the U.S. My question was about your NGO, Historians Without Borders. You spoke about compiling different narratives around the globe. How is it that you're going to make a concrete difference rather than just adding to the noise of the discourse that already exists? In what way will you make a concrete, difference?
Well, one thing which we are also working on is establishing a roster of historians, qualified historians, who would make their knowledge and experience available for any conflict resolution and mediation efforts. So if there is a call for independent historians to work on some issues, help and thus contribute to conflict resolution, we would want to see to it that we have qualified people for this kind of job. Of course, the most important thing, I think, is always to get the historians from in any conflict, from both conflict parties, from all conflict parties, to sit together. But sometimes third parties can help facilitate this, as we hope to do with Ukrainian and Russian historians, for example. I think for the first step in any efforts in this respect is always to get the historians and people to listen to the other side's narrative. You don't have to accept it as such, you can contest it, but you have to know it, and you have to be able to discuss it. That is the first step. In the final step may be that historians can agree on writing a common history which covers the experiences of all parties to the conflict. We are still a long way from this, but we had a workshop, by the way, at the conference on how to write a common history for Israel and Palestinians. We had an Israeli and a Palestinian historian there. If it was up to them, I think they could do it, but that's not enough still.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, in that case, thank you again very, very much, Erkki, for making the trip to Germany, and we really very much appreciated the speech.